The horizon on Solgrave was a jagged line of cracked rock and swirling dust, a planet where silence carried weight and shadows stretched unnaturally long. Lieutenant Marcus Reed adjusted the visor of his helmet, its thermal display flickering as the day's heat began to fade. The patrol route was routine, an endless trudge across a barren landscape where nothing ever happened. But Reed had learned to distrust stillness. It had a way of hiding the unexpected. As the squad marched toward the outpost, the comm link strapped to Reed's wrist crackled to life. It wasn't the usual burst of static that plagued the equipment on this planet. This was different, structured, rhythmic. "Help. Mass air," the voice stammered through the interference. Reed froze mid-step, his brow furrowing. "You hear that?" he asked, glancing at Corporal Willis, who gave him a shrug. "Probably solar interference messing with the signal. Just noise," Willis replied, already bored. Reed wasn't so sure. The voice, faint and distorted though it was, had a cadence that set his nerves on edge. A human cadence. He adjusted the comm link's frequency, trying to clean up the distortion, but the signal remained garbled. "Help me, yeah." The squad leader, Sergeant Kellar, growled through the group channel. "Ignore it, Reed. We've got protocols, and chasing ghosts isn't one of them." Reed's gut twisted. "With respect, sir, that sounded like someone in trouble. Shouldn't we investigate?" "It's an abandoned rock. Nobody's out here except us," Kellar snapped. "Stay focused. We've got a schedule to keep." Reed swallowed his irritation but couldn't let it go. As the squad continued, the voice repeated every few minutes, a broken mantra that gnawed at his resolve. The scanner on his wrist, set to locate atmospheric anomalies, began to pick up something strange. Faint, scattered radiation spikes pulsed in sync with the signal. The scanner's display flashed a map. Coordinates not listed on any briefing. "Lieutenant," Willis said, glancing over Reed's shoulder. "That's an old survey station, isn't it? Thought those were mothballed years ago." Reed nodded. "Looks like it's still active, barely." Kellar wouldn't approve, but Reed decided to follow his instincts. When the squad reached the next waypoint, he lingered behind, letting the others press on. He tapped a private channel to Willis. "Cover for me if Kellar notices. I'll check it out and meet back before anyone knows I'm gone." Willis hesitated, but finally nodded. "Don't make me come looking for you." The trek to the station was grueling, each step stirring up clouds of reddish dust that clung to Reed's boots. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. The structure finally came into view as the pale Solgrave sun dipped below the horizon, a hulking silhouette against the dying light. The base was massive, its reinforced walls scarred by time and weather. It had been built for resilience, yet something about its lopsided towers and broken antennae screamed abandonment. A metallic stench clung to the air, sharp and chemical. Reed approached cautiously, his rifle drawn. The signal grew stronger with each step, crackling incessantly in his ear. The front doors were ajar, forced open long ago. He squeezed through the gap and into darkness. Inside, his flashlight cut through layers of dust and cobwebs. The interior was cavernous, with long, empty corridors and debris scattered across the floor. The station had clearly been evacuated in a hurry. As Reed ventured deeper, the faint hum of machinery broke the silence. His scanner led him to a small control room where a terminal still flickered, its screen cracked but operational. The terminal's interface was rudimentary, its data logs partially corrupted. Reed tapped through menus, the eerie glow of the screen illuminating his tense face. Fragments of old files surfaced, reports of experiments conducted in secret, buried deep within the colonists' archives. Optimization Project, Phase 1 Trials, read one headline. He opened the file. The colonists had been desperate to adapt to Solgrave's harsh conditions, but terraforming was too slow, too resource-intensive. Instead, they turned inward, experimenting on their own DNA to create humans capable of thriving in alien environments. The results were described in clinical detail: enhanced endurance, increased resistance to radiation. But the tone shifted in later entries. Subjects began exhibiting unintended physiological anomalies. The words grew more ominous: mutation, uncontrolled cellular integration, biological instability. A final entry chilled him to the bone. The station is compromised. We are the experiment now. A sudden noise, wet and dragging, echoed from somewhere deeper in the base. Reed spun, his rifle aimed toward the source. The darkness beyond the control room seemed to ripple, as though it were alive. The signal crackled again, louder now, almost deafening. "Help! Air!" Reed backed toward the door, his breath quickening. The flashlight in his hand shook as he searched for movement in the shadows. The sound grew closer, a slithering that seemed to come from every direction at once. He bolted, his boots pounding the metal floor as the comlink's static screamed in his ear. Something was following, something unseen but impossibly close. He didn't stop running until he burst back into the cold night, the station's shadow looming behind him like a predator. The signal was gone. Silence had returned. But the feeling in Reed's chest told him the nightmare was only beginning. The cold air outside the station did little to calm Marcus Reed's nerves. His heart raced, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. The whispers of movement he had heard inside the station still echoed in his ears, but the unnatural silence that followed was worse. Reed knew the choice before him: leave now and report the signal, or go back inside and face whatever was lurking in the darkness. He gripped his rifle tighter. Leaving wasn't an option, not yet. The files he had seen suggested something catastrophic had happened here, something the colony's leadership had buried. He had to know what. Swallowing his fear, Reed re-entered the station. The stench hit him first. It was different this time, thicker and more pungent, a sickly mixture of rotting meat and chemicals. His flashlight illuminated the twisted remains of furniture and shattered equipment scattered across the corridor. The walls seemed to ripple in the faint beam of light, as if alive. Reed chalked it up to exhaustion and adrenaline, but the gnawing unease grew stronger with every step. The corridor led to a lab, its reinforced doors hanging crooked on their hinges. Reed hesitated before stepping inside. The air was colder here, heavy with an unnatural stillness. His flashlight passed over shattered glass tanks and overturned tables. What looked like human limbs half-formed, bloated, lay in a heap against one wall, their skin glistening with a strange, oily sheen. The walls caught his attention next. They weren't made of the same metal as the rest of the station. Instead, they had a fleshy texture, patches of darkened organic matter spreading outward like veins. As Reed moved closer, he noticed something horrifying. Embedded within the walls were fragments of bone, tufts of hair, and even faces, human faces. Their eyes were closed, mouths frozen in silent screams. Reed recoiled, nearly dropping his flashlight. He scanned the room, his breathing shallow and fast. The faint noise of something wet and sticky reached his ears, coming from deeper within the station. The sound grew louder, a slithering drag that was both rhythmic and unnatural. He turned toward the source of the noise, rifle raised. Something shifted in the shadows at the far end of the lab, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice echoing off the pulsating walls. The thing stepped into the light, or perhaps it grew out of the darkness itself. It was humanoid in shape, but grotesquely elongated, its arms trailing like sinewy tendrils. Its skin glowed faintly, crisscrossed with veins that pulsed with a bioluminescent light. Where a face should have been, there was only a shifting mass of flesh, as if it couldn't decide on a final form. Reed fired instinctively. The bullets tore into the creature, dark fluid spraying against the walls. It let out a sound, a high-pitched guttural scream that reverberated in Reed's chest. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it lunged toward him with unnatural speed. Reed dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its swipe. Its claws raked against the wall, sending chunks of fleshy material splattering to the floor. The wall itself reacted, convulsing and oozing more of the dark fluid, as if the station were alive and in pain. He scrambled to his feet and fired again, this time aiming for the creature's legs. The shots struck true, and the thing collapsed in a writhing heap. Reed didn't wait to see if it would get back up. He sprinted out of the lab, his boots slipping on the slick, organic floor. The corridor had changed. The walls now bulged with grotesque growths, pulsating in sync with an unseen rhythm. Tendrils sprouted from the ceiling, swaying like grasping fingers. Reed's panic surged as he realized the station itself was transforming, becoming a part of the same horrific organism. He passed a shattered observation window, his flashlight catching movement beyond the glass. Another creature, larger and more grotesque, was slithering through a cavernous space filled with fleshy structures and bioluminescent sacs. It paused, turning toward the light. Reed didn't stop. He ran blindly through the corridors, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The slithering noise followed, accompanied by the faint sounds of distant screams. They weren't human, not anymore. He finally stumbled into a control room, slamming the door shut behind him. The room seemed untouched, its walls still metal, its consoles still intact. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to breathe. The monitors flickered to life, displaying grainy footage of the station's lower levels. The creatures were everywhere, moving in and out of what looked like a massive central chamber. The chamber's walls were pulsating, covered in the same organic material that had overtaken the lab. At the center of it all was a massive fleshy mass, a grotesque heart, beating slowly, methodically. A message flashed across one of the consoles. Automated system failure. Biocontainment breached. Reed stared at the screen, the words sinking in. This wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. The colonists had created something far worse. A living ecosystem, one that consumed everything it touched. The slithering noise returned, louder now, just outside the door. The creatures were closing in. Reed checked his rifle, his ammunition nearly depleted. His options were running out, but one thing was clear. The nightmare was far from over. Reed leaned against the control room wall, the cold metal biting through his suit. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, fogging the visor of his helmet. The distant slithering of the creatures echoed through the corridors, a reminder that they were still hunting him. The station was alive in ways that defied reason, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not just by the creatures, but by the station itself. The monitors before him flickered again, drawing his attention. The footage showed a massive chamber far below the surface, its walls pulsing like a living organ. Bioluminescent sacs hung from the ceiling, their glow casting a sickly light on the grotesque structures below. In the center, a massive, writhing mass dominated the space. It pulsed with slow, deliberate rhythm, as though breathing. Another console displayed a schematic of the station. A blinking marker indicated his position on the upper levels, far above the chamber he had seen. Beneath it, a single elevator shaft led into the depths. The thought of descending into the belly of this nightmare made his skin crawl, but the terminal's logs had hinted at answers in the lower levels, answers that might explain the signal, the creatures, and the horrors overtaking the station. The sound of claws scraping against metal snapped him back to the present. The creatures were close. Without another thought, he activated the schematic's guidance system, illuminating the path to the elevator. He moved quickly but cautiously, his rifle raised, the flashlight beam cutting through the suffocating darkness. The corridor to the elevator shaft was worse than the others. The walls here had almost entirely transformed into fleshy growths, veins running across their surface, pulsating faintly. The floor squelched beneath his boots, and tendrils dangled from the ceiling like grotesque vines. Reed pressed forward, trying to ignore the sensation of the station itself shifting underfoot. He reached the elevator, its doors hanging askew. The car itself was still operational, its lights flickering faintly. Reed stepped inside and hit the control panel. The doors groaned shut, and the elevator shuddered as it began its descent. The ride down was agonizingly slow. The dim lights inside the elevator flickered with each passing second, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Reed gripped his rifle tightly, his finger hovering over the trigger. The comlink crackled to life again. "Help, The voice was clearer now, but no less fragmented. It sounded distorted, almost layered, as though multiple voices were speaking at once. Reed clenched his jaw, trying to block out the sound. The elevator came to an abrupt stop. The doors groaned as they slid open, revealing a vast, dimly lit corridor. Unlike the upper levels, the walls here were fully organic, pulsating with rhythmic life. The air was thick with humidity, and a foul metallic stench filled his lungs. Reed stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the floor. The corridor stretched on, its walls lined with grotesque shapes, half-formed limbs, twisted faces, and what looked like organs embedded in the flesh. Some of the faces twitched as he passed, their mouths opening in silent, agonized screams. The slithering sound returned, louder and more distinct. It wasn't just one creature this time, it was many. Shadows moved at the edge of his flashlight beam, and he caught fleeting glimpses of their forms. Some crawled on all fours, their elongated limbs propelling them forward with unsettling speed. Others slithered like snakes, their bodies covered in slick, pulsating flesh. Reed pressed forward, following the schematic's guidance. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, the one he had seen on the monitor. He stopped at the entrance, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it. The chamber was alive. Its walls pulsed with the same bioluminescent veins that ran through the station, casting a sickly green glow over everything. The ground was covered in a web of fleshy tendrils that writhed and pulsed with life. At the center, the massive, writhing mass dominated the space, a grotesque, heart-like structure that pulsed with slow, deliberate rhythm. Reed's scanner beeped, detecting radiation spikes and anomalous biological activity. The readings were off the charts, unlike anything he had ever seen. He stepped closer, his rifle raised, his eyes scanning the chamber for any signs of movement. The mass quivered, and a low, guttural sound filled the chamber. The tendrils on the floor writhed more violently, as though reacting to his presence. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't random noise, it was a voice. "Join us." Reed froze. The voice was deep, layered, and resonated through his entire body. It wasn't coming from the comm link, it was coming from the mass itself. The tendrils lashed out suddenly, one wrapping around his ankle. Reed fired his rifle, the bullets tearing through the tendril and freeing him. The mass let out a deafening roar, and the chamber came alive. Creatures emerged from the shadows, their grotesque forms illuminated by the pulsing light. They charged toward him, their movements erratic and horrifying. Reed ran, firing blindly as he moved. The creatures screamed as the bullets struck them, their bodies convulsing before collapsing into the writhing tendrils below. But for every one he killed, two more appeared. He reached a side corridor, diving inside and slamming the door shut behind him. The creatures pounded against the other side, their guttural screams filling the air. Reed stumbled back, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The corridor led deeper into the station, its walls narrowing and twisting unnaturally. He knew he couldn't stay here. The creatures wouldn't stop, and the station itself seemed determined to consume him. But one thing was clear. The source of the signal, the nightmare that had overtaken the station, was tied to the mass in the chamber. If he was going to survive, he would have to destroy it, or die trying. The air in the narrow corridor was stifling, heavy with the acrid stench of decaying flesh, and something far worse, something alien. Reed leaned against the wall, his muscles trembling from exertion. His mind raced as he reloaded his rifle, fingers fumbling with the last of his ammunition. Every shot counted now. The pounding on the door behind him grew louder, the creatures outside relentless in their pursuit. Their guttural screams reverberated through the corridor, a maddening cacophony that seemed to gnaw at Reed's sanity. He couldn't stay here. Ahead, the corridor twisted and narrowed, its walls pulsing faintly with the rhythm of the living station. The schematic on his wrist showed a secondary route back to the surface, a maintenance shaft that bypassed the main elevator. If he could reach it, he had a chance. If not, the pounding stopped. Silence. Reed's heart sank. He raised his rifle, eyes fixed on the door. The creatures didn't give up. They were adapting, learning. The silence was worse than the noise. It meant they were hunting him differently now. The wall to his left convulsed. A face pushed through the fleshy surface, its eyes wide and unseeing, its mouth twisting in a grotesque approximation of speech. "Stay," the voice gurgled, wet and unnatural. "Join us," Reed fired, the bullets tearing through the wall. The face vanished, but the wall rippled, veins bursting and oozing dark fluid. The station screamed, a deep, resonant sound that came from everywhere at once. The ground beneath him shifted, tendrils sprouting from the floor and reaching for his legs. Reed darted forward, firing at the writhing appendages. He sprinted down the corridor, his flashlight flickering as the station convulsed around him. The shaft was just ahead. Its hatch was slightly ajar, the metal edges warped but intact. Reed wrenched it open and slid inside, the shaft's cold metal a sharp contrast to the organic nightmare outside. He gripped the ladder and began his ascent, each rung a struggle against his burning muscles and the mounting terror clawing at his mind. The shaft was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of his helmet's visor. Above him, faint daylight spilled through a grating. The surface was close. He climbed faster, the sound of something scraping below him growing louder. Reed glanced down. A creature was in the shaft, its elongated limbs gripping the walls as it climbed with inhuman speed. Its bioluminescent veins pulsed erratically, illuminating its grotesque form. Its eyeless face turned upward, locked on him. He fired down the shaft. The bullets struck the creature, tearing into its slick flesh. It let out a deafening shriek, but didn't stop. Reed climbed faster, his lungs burning, his hands slick with sweat. The grating above him suddenly burst open, the tendrils of the station forcing their way into the shaft. They wriggled toward him, cutting off his path to the surface. "No!" he screamed, firing wildly. The tendrils writhed, recoiling as the bullets tore through them, but they kept coming. Below, the creature was nearly upon him. It reached out, its claws scraping against his boot. Reed kicked hard, the impact sending the creature tumbling back into the darkness, its shriek fading as it fell. He turned his attention back to the tendrils, now inches from his face. With no ammunition left, he grabbed his knife and hacked at them, the blade slicing through the sinewy flesh. The tendrils recoiled again, and Reed seized the opening. He climbed the final rungs, pulling himself out of the shaft and into the pale light of Solgrave's surface. The air was thin and cold, but it felt cleaner, freer. He didn't stop. He ran toward the emergency beacon he had activated earlier, its pulsing blue light a distant glimmer of hope. Behind him, the ground erupted. The station's living core had broken through, a massive pulsating mass of flesh and tendrils that spread like a cancer across the barren landscape. The creatures spilled out with it, their grotesque forms writhing and twisting as they spread across the horizon. Reed reached the beacon and slammed his hand on the activation panel. A deafening roar filled the air as a dropship descended from the clouds, its engines scattering the dust around him. The hatch opened and he stumbled inside, collapsing onto the cold metal floor. The pilot shouted something, but Reed couldn't hear over the roar of the engines and the chaos outside. The ship lifted off, the ground below falling away as the nightmare receded into the distance. Through the viewport, Reed saw the full scale of the horror. The station's core was expanding, tendrils spreading out like roots, consuming everything in their path. The creatures swarmed the landscape, their glowing veins visible even from the air. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Commands ordered a sterilization. They're dropping charges. Hang on." Reed watched as the sky lit up with flashes of light. Orbital bombardments rained down, striking the station and its sprawling infestation. Explosions rippled across the surface, engulfing the nightmare in fire and ash. The dropship ascended higher, the planet shrinking below them. Reed leaned back, his body heavy with exhaustion, his mind a blur of relief and horror. The comlink crackled again. "Help. Air." The same distorted voice, the same haunting cadence. Reed stared at the comlink, his heart sinking. The signal hadn't stopped. It would never stop.